Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this virtual town hall with U.S. Congressman Paul Tonko about the federal government shutdown. Tonight's conversation will focus on the Republican-led government shutdown, its impacts on individuals, families, workers, and our communities, and how Democrats are fighting for affordability and to protect healthcare and vital services. During tonight's program, Congressman Tonko will be answering questions that were submitted by residents from across New York's 20th Congressional District. We will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. At this time, please welcome on screen the U.S. Representative for New York's 20th Congressional District, proudly representing the capital region of New York in the U.S. House of Representatives, our Congressman, Paul Tonko.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Paul Tonko, and do thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight. Since the federal government shut down on October 1st, I have fielded a number of questions from constituents on the various reasons for the shutdown and how it could impact their lives. And I plan to spend the bulk of our time this evening directly answering your questions. Now, before we dive into that, I did want to take a quick moment to describe just how we got here and where I think we are heading. As many of you know, Republicans currently control the presidency, the Senate, and the House. So it's their job to keep our government running. They have failed at that job, and now the American people are paying the price. Instead of putting forward a budget that reins in Donald Trump's lawlessness and addresses the healthcare affordability crisis, Republicans have put forward a dirty partisan spending plan that does nothing to address rising costs for average Americans. With control of both chambers of Congress, Republicans could pass this dirty budget bill on their own tomorrow if they really wanted to. If this Republican plan passes, hundreds of thousands of people will indeed lose their health care, and millions more will see their costs skyrocket. Current estimates show Americans would see their out-of-pocket premiums increase by 114% if Republicans refuse to act. Now, more than 10,000 residents in our own capital region would see their health care costs go through the roof. A family of four, for example, earning $64,000 a year, would see their annual premiums rise by more than $2,500, or a 426% increase. This healthcare crisis can't wait until the end of the year, despite what Republicans claim. This month, insurance plans are already finalizing rates with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to give notice to enrollees what their premiums will be next year. Open enrollment in New York begins in just a few weeks. Each day that Republicans refuse to negotiate and join us in upholding these ACA credits, more and more Americans will be left without care. So the health and well-being of the constituents that I represent and millions of Americans is not something I am willing to compromise on. But instead of coming to the table to end this shutdown and address the healthcare costs and the healthcare needs of families, President Trump and his administration are working their hardest to make this shutdown as painful as possible for working Americans. In these past few days, Trump has threatened to fire tens of thousands of federal workers. He has suggested some federal workers who have been furloughed during the government shutdown will not receive back pay, and he's illegally canceled billions in energy projects across our nation, including nearly $180 million worth awarded here in our own capital region. So let's be clear on what he's doing here. Trump is using American jobs, lives, and livelihoods as a bargaining chip in a tyrannical attempt to curb dissent and accumulate more power for himself. Threatening retribution for your political opponents is the behavior of dictators, not presidents. This is exactly the type of lawless behavior that Democrats are fighting to rein in. Now, I was always taught to stand up to bullies, and that's what I plan to do. If Republicans want my vote on their budget, they need to earn it by making real concessions on addressing Trump's lawlessness and our health crisis. But instead of sitting down at the negotiating table, House Republicans haven't even bothered showing up to Washington, D.C. since September 19th. Now, we are in the 8th day of this reckless Republican shutdown, leaving vital government services at risk, harming our economy, and putting hundreds of thousands of federal employees' lives in limbo. In solidarity with those federal employees who are being asked to work without pay, I have also asked that my pay be withheld for the duration of this shutdown. As of right now, the House is scheduled to return to session on Tuesday. It is my hope that Republican leadership actually brings members back to town so that we can have an open dialogue, a dialogue on how just best to reopen this government, hold this lawlessness administration accountable, and bring down costs for the American people. With that, I look forward to getting to as many of your questions as possible. I again thank you for joining us this evening. Your time, your interest, your concern are all cherished. So with that, let's move to the questions.
Thank you, Congressman. Our first question comes from Mary in the town of Waterford. Mary asks the following: who will be affected by budget cuts to healthcare? The Republicans keep saying it will be undocumented immigrants, but I think we should provide healthcare to all people living in the United States, end quote.
Well, here's a point that I have responded to over and over again. It's an outright lie. Once you've spread the misinformation and disinformation and you've been alerted to the fact that it is incorrect, it's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for tax credits for the Affordable Care Act, for Medicaid, for Medicare. Simply illegal. Now, however, many Americans are indeed impacted. For example, some of the most harsh outcomes are resting with our middle income senior population. And they will see some of the out of pocket premium rises that are the strongest, the largest out there, if the enhanced credits expire. Now, as an example, a 60-year-old couple making $80,000 would see their healthcare costs increase by some $17,500 on average. Now, letting these tax credits expire would have an impact of $23 billion, somewhat of a $23 billion tax hike on the American public, on the middle class families of this country. Now, it's a huge impact also on small business and entrepreneurs. 1 in 5 of employee-owned and small businesses would, with owners between the range of 21 and 64 years of age, would really be impacted. They rely heavily on the ACA for coverage, the American health plan coverage that they have with the ACA. And 7 in 10 ACA marketplace enrollees say they could not afford coverage if their premiums were doubled. So Republicans, in fact, are hurting their own constituents by allowing these subsidies to expire, because 57% of the ACA enrolled marketplace individuals are in Republican congressional districts. So the statistics hurt them, and it should be all the better reason that they come to the table to negotiate and work on a plan that will avoid these draconian increases that indeed would be painful. But, to the illegal or undocumented immigrants, they'll mention words like illegal aliens, whatever demeaning rhetoric they can share, but they continue to talk about those being the people, the 15 million that will lose health care. And that is inaccurate. And they've been alerted to the fact that they're spreading lies, misinformation, and disinformation.
Thank you, Congressman. Our next question comes from Roger from Clifton Park, who asks the following: besides registering to vote and voting itself, what can we as citizens do to resist the actions of this regime? End quote.
Well, I've been consistently calling out this administration and the Republican Party. What we have here is outright um, failed leadership. And as I indicated, they could pass this budget plan tomorrow if they so chose, but they're not responding um, to the rhetoric, to the concerns of the American public. And I've also been pushing my own party to be bolder in this moment with the urgency that this moment demands. Absolutely important as we have the marketplace adjusting these premiums with the new information that has come down from the big ugly bill. But words and votes in Congress are simply not enough. We need people to engage in this process. People power now, more than ever, is essential. And we need to make certain that that you make the message clear that this threat is real, that it will impact your household income severely, and that essential services, the right to health care, is being threatened. And so the messaging here is incredibly important, and people power is just another additive to this outburst, this outcry of unacceptable in response to the Republican plan.
Thank you. And we also have Paul from Schenectady asking the following. What else, besides not voting for the Republican-backed budget, are you and the Democratic Party doing to force Trump and his enablers to uphold their oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution? End quote.
Well, I thank Paul for that question. This brings to mind the work, the efforts by our framers and our founders. They saw it essential for three distinct branches of government to serve as a check and a balance on the whole process. And the efforts here by this administration to usurp power and to invest it in one individual walks us away from a democracy. And so it's very important that people are reminded and they support this whole notion that the power of the purse, the spending that is determined, that goes to the executive branch by legislative intent, is where we should be in this whole process. The legislature, in a bicameral, bipartisan way, the two-house, two-party effort, directs the president. I would suggest that perhaps we have even greater than equal power because that power of the purse rests with the House, then confirmed by the Senate. And so that step, when you bend the knee to this president, as my Republican colleagues are doing, you've relinquished the power, the good power invested in you that is needed to be expended on behalf of the people. Why would you walk away from that trust and that responsibility? That is really making for some very difficult situations here. Now, as to some of the investments that are not being recognized by this president, include over $180 million worth from the Department of Energy, where awards were granted, and now he is canceling those. That translates into lost jobs, but it translates into lost opportunity for energy consumers to drive down those costs, to make certain that they're enabled to provide for energy efficient outcomes in their home setting or in their business setting. This is the drastic response by this president who just sweeps those dollars away when he doesn't have the constitutional authority. And so we need to, again, address lawlessness in this document when we negotiate in the ensuing days. I would strongly recommend that we have language in the agreement that says when Congress determines what programs are going to be invested in and to what amount, that needs to be honored by the executive branch. We've even seen rescission efforts, a process where you roll back what was agreed to. They have been put on the table and they have been put into working order by this president. That is unacceptable. So the lawlessness, the lack of respect for the legislative process needs to be addressed in bold terms because We're fighting the fight for the public. And if we say these dollars go toward healthcare, that's the legislative intent that needs to be honored.
Thank you, Congressman. Our next question comes from Karen in Scotia. She asked the following: what else can Democrats do to reach those listening to right-leaning media and help them understand that Republicans control both houses and the White House and are ultimately responsible for this shutdown? End quote.
Right. There's, a lot of finger pointing, but if they wanted to, they could address that budget tomorrow and have it done. But they're using this shutdown, and I would say shakedown by the president, as an opportunity to not address the Affordable Care Act. Before this budget year, there have been in the past 60 requests of me to vote down the Affordable Care Act. Never with, always a repeal, but never a replacement. And so we're back to that old song and dance. They do want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but they have no replacement mechanism. So they're hiding behind the shutdown. I say, let's go forward and address healthcare in its fullness, in its depth, including research. Now, when you talk about, situations where people are struggling with drastic health challenges, some of the best hope that we can provide comes in the order of research. And when these efforts and research, I would suggest, is part of our DNA spirit, pioneer spirit in this country. We have always been about innovation and exploring new worlds and going beyond boundaries and limitations. That has been our hallmark. And research that we can provide is threatened by this entire budget bill. New York 20 research institutions that conduct research into cancer, into Alzheimer's, into Parkinson's, into macular degeneration, are all being threatened by a cut in funding. Agencies that in the federal government address research, from the Department of Defense to the National Institutes of Health to the Center for Disease Control. These foundations, these institutions are being cut drastically. Republicans included a mandatory 57% cut to the congressionally directed medical research program in this last CR. So, when you're slashing research by 40% in the institutions, in the NIH, the National Institute of Health, the CDC, the Department of Defense, you're suffocating the hope that we need to provide and deliver for so many consumers across this country who are inspired, who are revitalized by that hope in their drastic challenge for maintaining their health and fighting some really difficult health battles. So we can do and we must do better. And again, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Michael in Albany. Michael shares the following: as I'm battling AML, which is a type of blood cancer for our viewers, for the last 3 years, what is wrong with supporting new research grants to fight all cancers? And how can we trust the information coming from the CDC? End quote.
Well, as I indicated in this last response, the whole effort for research is a critical component of quality healthcare. And I would suggest nutrition is also. The drastic cuts that they have made to nutrition for seniors, for veterans, for our children will be impactful, severely impactful. Seniors who are recovering from surgery or are chronically ill require a sound nutrition. And when you cut into the nutrition and the wellness and the preventative aspects of healthcare, you're doing damage in that regard. Telehealth that has been damaged. Research that is so important to providing for the innovation and the new opportunities to conquer diseases. Absolutely essential. And we've had so many of our professional institutions and universities and states, including New York, that are saying they're going to try and step up to provide science-based efforts in the midst of this federal dilemma. But basically, Washington needs to deliver here. And when you hear of a constituent who asked this question about the hope they have as they fight a very rare form of cancer, of blood cancer, the research that is developed, that is authorized and conducted, not only provides sound jobs, but provides that genomic discovery that can then be shared oftentimes in the direct mission, but also in an indirect way with affecting other illnesses with genomic discovery that can lead to some progress in those other realms too.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Next question is from Myron from Troy, who asked the following. What are you and the Democrats doing to protect unionized federal workers? End quote.
Well, we want to make certain that, whether you were furloughed or deemed essential and working without getting a paycheck, or if you're at risk of being fired in this next round where he just seems to want to continue with the Elon Musk chainsaw in reforming government, which is a cruel outcome. I would say if there's anything a word to characterize this CR, this continuing resolution, this budget package, it's cruelty to the nth degree. And so we have to make certain that we reach to the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act of 2019 to make certain that they will be paid, that guarantee is there. He's also threatened to illegally block pay for furloughed employees. And there will be litigation offered. There will be court challenges in that regard, and we'll be participating in that effort. And, just making certain that we ensure every federal worker receives his or her pay to which they're entitled. And, we as a federal government, as managers in the White House and the Congress, need to respect our workers. It's a two-way street, and that respect is essential. You respect your employees that provide the services, the research, the programming upon which this country operates and by which consumers are served.
Thank you, Congressman. We have a question from the YouTube comments under a username, Let's Be Superheroes, but they asked the following. Trump appears to be using the shutdown as an excuse for further illegal action. Considering how the GOP Congress has enabled him thus far, do we have reason to believe that they want the shutdown to end? End quote.
Oh, some are suspicious that this is just another way, an excuse by which to conduct cruel behavior and outright reduce government. It was always with them, it was about waste, fraud, and inefficiency. I can tell you from the many I have talked to in this congressional district that are federal employees that are now no longer part of that equation. They have said no one came in to understand the mission statement of their division or their agency. No one came in to see how that mission statement was being implemented. No one looked at the workers' files to see that they, through their career, had received superior reviews. No one looked at that. So it was just reducing the size of government. They didn't make it more efficient, less fraudulent, more productive. They just cut it. That is not reform. That is denying programs and services to people across this country. And so, yes, they very well could be using this as a rationale, but I think the public is going to push back because as we go through the ensuing days and weeks of this fall, as the marketplace is adjusting their premiums and establishing the the levels for those premiums, people will be notified and they will push back, fight back, and speak out. I'm convinced. And they are trying to walk away from this healthcare situation. Forever, they have fought hard to repeal the Affordable Care Act and never having a replacement. And I think they're at that same step in the process, just rejuvenated with this second term with Trump. But this is a group that is well intent to get the Project 2025 agenda completely in place. And they've moved several feet into this, probably two-thirds through that whole Project 2025, a plan that this president in his last campaign offered denial. He heard some talk about it. He wasn't very, he didn't understand what it was per se. He heard there was some good, some bad. The circle of administrators around this individual are the architects of that Project 2025. And now we're seeing what action is taken to implement that plan, which is a disaster for working families of this country and for our retirees and our veterans.
Our next question comes from Mark in Loudonville. Mark asks, how might this impact domestic and international travel from airports to customs and visas? End quote.
Well, there are some concerns that with the air traffic controllers, there's concerns for safety. Um, we are we are hopeful that as we go through this process, the air traffic controllers will be working through this effort. I know that on Monday there were no controllers at the Burbank Airport for almost 5 hours, and that there were shortages also at places like Nashville. But again, I think the administration has to, in its oversight, make certain that in their role as a transportation agency, for instance, that those numbers are monitored closely, because I think safety is a direct function of the number of professionals that you have on as air traffic controllers. And so we have to work those terms into safety measures that will be there to protect the public that is utilizing the airline industry.
Our next question comes from Barry from Albany. They ask, are lawmakers taking any legal actions to restore this rescinded funding, in particular funds for renewable energy, healthcare, and education? End quote.
Right. We have said that it is about legislation, communication, and litigation. And with the legislation, we're trying, however, to introduce bills. Of course, we don't have the majority. But again, as pressure begins to build on my colleagues across the aisle, on the Republicans, we're hopeful. Already you've seen some people peeled off about not supporting addressing the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act. So already there's some weak knees developing, but that legislation will be important communication so that the public knows what the fight is about, and that they crank up the volume and they insist that we do better. And then litigation. In the beginning, the litigation wasn't going as well as we would like, but now it seems we're winning more and more cases. And we hope that litigation, if it can't resolve it immediately, can at least delay it. And then it becomes very important that we have a legislature, a Congress in the future, very near future, that will offer a majority that will stand in the way of this agenda for draconian cuts and lack of sensitivity to the American public.
Thanks so much, Congressman. Those were all the questions that we had the time to answer at tonight's event. Would you like to offer any final thoughts before we end tonight's broadcast?
Sure. In our republic, a representative democracy, it is important for us to now fight for this democracy as we fight for healthcare, affordability of essential services across the board. Housing costs, utility costs, groceries, all of the efforts and the healthcare issue, of course, which has been a premier talking point. We need to make certain that it's about affordability and we drive down those costs. I heard it over and over again, and I know my constituents heard it over and over again. On day one, costs are coming down. Well, since the beginning of this administration, which seems like eternity, in the few months that have introduced this new administration, we have only seen costs going up. And to complicate it further, to provide uncertainty and unpredictability, the tariff war which is all over the place, up, down, on, off. You know, if anything, I hear from the business community, the small businesses, the farming community, that the tariffs are destructive. We have to make certain that we don't further destroy this economy. We inherited an economy that was the best comeback in the international marketplace post-COVID, and that's been wrecked and challenged. So we need to go forward and make certain that we respond on behalf of the American people, on behalf of American businesses and manufacturers. I'm optimistic because we can, within the frameworks of our democracy, win this battle. It's the people stepping up with their representatives that will make the difference. People power every step of the way. And because of that, I remain intensely hopeful that we will win this battle and bring hope to the doorsteps of individuals across this great country. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. For more information about how the Republican shutdown may impact you or your family, please visit our website, tonko.house.gov. Again, that's tonko.house.gov for any updates or resources. If you need any assistance with a federal agency, Congressman Tonko's offices remain open during this shutdown and ready to help. Our office can be reached via phone at 518-465-0700. Again, that phone number is 518-465-0700. You can also stay informed by connecting with Congressman Tonko on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and X. All social media handles are at Rep. Paul Tonko. This concludes tonight's virtual town hall with U.S. Congressman Paul Tonko to answer questions about the Republican federal government shutdown.